The boardroom erupted in laughter when the billionaire CEO mocked his daughter's voice, but the janitor sitting quietly in the corner stood up and said 5 words that turned the entire room into silence. "Say that again about my daughter." Before we dive in, leave a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story will blow your mind. The boardroom gleamed like a cathedral of glass and chrome, polished to an impossible shine, the kind of place where secrets weren't whispered, but signed into contracts worth more than small countries. Jack Carter moved through it like a shadow. His mop bucket squeaked when he rolled it across the floor, and even that sound felt like a crime here. He bent down, his rough hands, scarred from years of odd jobs, sorting cables that the AV tech had left in a tangle beneath the conference table. His shirt smelled faintly of bleach. His boots left faint marks he quickly wiped away. He had done this dance 1,000 times in countless rooms that never remembered him. He was the man who made sure the world stayed clean so others could dirty it again. The leather chairs around the table loomed large, each one reserved for someone who held power in their signatures and portfolios. Jack's name would never belong in one of those black leather seats. He knew it, and so did everyone else. That was fine. He had no illusions about being part of their world. His world waited at home, sitting cross-legged on the floor with crayons scattered around her like jewels. Emma, 9 years old, hair the color of wheat in summer, eyes too old for her age. The drawing she'd given him this morning was still folded in his jacket pocket, the paper already softening from the warmth of his body. Daddy's Castle, she had titled it in big block letters, a crayon fortress with turrets made of buckets and a flag that read "Safe." She had said he built it every night while she slept. He carried it because some nights he needed to believe her. The door burst open behind him. Voices, sharp and fast, filled the room like a current of electricity. The first to enter was Victoria Cross herself, flanked by her entourage of executives and advisors. She was as striking as the story said, tall, sharp lines softened only by diamond earrings, her black suit tailored to intimidate. People didn't just look at her, they braced themselves. She spoke before she sat, her voice cutting across the room with precision. "We're not here to repeat numbers. We're here to fix them. If you can't offer a solution, don't speak." The others nodded quickly, papers shuffling like frightened birds. Jack straightened from under the table, careful not to draw attention. He'd been told to finish quietly before the meeting started, but clearly that window had closed. He reached for his mop bucket, trying to ease it toward the corner. One of the younger assistants shot him a look that said, "Hurry up and disappear." Jack didn't mind. Disappearing was his specialty. But as he turned, the drawing in his pocket shifted. He felt it press against his chest, reminding him of Emma's trust. He paused, his hand brushing the folded paper, and for a second he let himself drift. What would she think if she saw him here? Would she see the invisible man, or the father who came home with tired hands but always made space for her drawings on the fridge? The executives bickered over graphs and forecasts, their words rising and crashing like waves against steel. Jack kept moving, his eyes low, but his mind elsewhere. He thought about Emma's quiet voice that morning when she asked, "Do they know you're important, Daddy?" He had smiled, kissed her forehead, and said, "They don't have to." But the truth stung. In places like this, men like him weren't important. They were part of the furniture. He reached the far corner of the boardroom, where the floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city lights like jewels spilled across black velvet. The skyline shimmered with wealth and ambition, and Jack's reflection hovered faintly against it, mop handle in hand. He looked small, out of place. He was used to that. What he wasn't used to was the sudden pulse in the air, the way the meeting seemed to take on a different charge, sharper, more dangerous. He didn't know yet what was about to happen, that in this very room, with this very woman at the head of the table, his invisibility would end. He didn't know that the folded drawing of Daddy's Castle in his pocket would become the quiet weapon that reminded everyone including himself, that dignity wasn't something granted by titles or suits. It was something carried in silence, in scars, in love. Jack tightened his grip on the mop handle, straightened his shoulders, and prepared to vanish once more into the background. He had no idea that in just a few minutes someone would try to laugh at the wrong thing, and when they did, the invisible man in the boardroom would finally be seen. The boardroom was a storm. Voices clashed like steel against steel, each executive more desperate than the last to prove their relevance. Spreadsheets glowed on screens. Charts rose and fell in red and green like the heartbeat of a dying giant. Every time someone stumbled over their numbers, Victoria Cross cut them down with the ease of someone sharpening her blade on their failure. She leaned back in her chair, black suit gleaming under the cold lights, her laughter sharp, clipped, controlled. It wasn't joy, it was dominance. And everyone at the table bent under it. Jack Carter kept to the shadows, mop in hand, rolling his bucket across the polished floorboards like it might shield him. He knew this rhythm well. Keep his head down. Be invisible. Don't interrupt the gods while they argue about the fate of worlds that had nothing to do with him. His fingers brushed unconsciously against his jacket pocket, feeling the folded paper inside. Emma's drawing. Daddy's castle. A fortress built of crayons and love. It steadied him, reminded him why he tolerated these rooms where he didn't belong. Then Ronald Dempsey spoke, smug, silver-haired, always leaning back like the chair existed solely to worship him. He had been sparring with another executive over projected losses when he suddenly leaned forward, lips curling into a grin that wasn't aimed at numbers at all. "We can't keep letting charity hires through the door," he said. His tone carried a lazy kind of cruelty, the kind that wasn't careless at all. It was intentional. His kid's special ed, right? Makes sense why he pushes a mop instead of numbers. For a second, no one moved. The words hung in the air like a dropped knife. Then the room erupted in laughter, not the kind that heals, but the kind that wounds. Sharp, slicing, designed to cut. Executives chuckled behind manicured hands, some louder than others, and the cruel rhythm of it filled the space like static. Even Victoria smirked, though her eyes flickered in a way that betrayed something she didn't want noticed. Jack froze. His grip on the mop handle tightened until his knuckles blanched. He had been called names before. He had been dismissed, ignored, belittled. He had let it roll off his back because survival meant silence. But this wasn't about him. This was Emma, his daughter. His quiet, bright, extraordinary little girl who filled her silence with drawings that spoke louder than words. The image of her face, the way she had whispered, "Promise?" the night before, pierced through him. The laughter grew. Each chuckle was a nail hammered deeper into his chest. The drawing in his pocket felt suddenly heavy, hot, as though the crayons themselves burned with the insult. He could almost hear Emma asking him the question she often did when kids at school teased her, "Why do they laugh when it's not funny?" He never had an answer, but he knew one thing now. He wouldn't let that question be asked of him. Not here, not tonight. Jack's jaw clenched. His chest rose once sharply, and for the first time in years, he didn't push the anger down. He let it rise, slow and deliberate, until it reached his throat, and then he spoke. The sound wasn't loud. It wasn't shouted over the cacophony, but it cut through the laughter like a blade sliding through silk. "Say that again about my daughter." The room went still. The laughter choked off mid-breath. Heads turned, startled, disbelieving that the voice had come from the corner, from the man in the janitor's uniform, holding a mop like a weapon. He didn't need to swing. Ronald blinked, his smirk faltering for the first time all night. Jack stepped forward, not fast, not reckless, but with a quiet weight that made every executive straighten in their chairs. His eyes locked on Ronald, steady, unflinching. The mop handle trembled slightly in his hands, not from fear, but from the force of everything he was holding back. His voice stayed low, calm, but it carried the kind of truth that couldn't be ignored. "Say that again about my daughter." No one laughed this time. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, alive, pressing against every polished wall of that boardroom. And in that silence, Jack Carter was no longer invisible. The words came out steady, unhurried, but they carried a weight no one in that room was prepared for. They weren't thunder, they weren't fire, but iron, cold, sharp, deliberate. Say that again about my daughter. The laughter that had moments ago bounced off glass and chrome walls collapsed into a suffocating silence. The echo of it lingered like an unwelcome ghost, now too ashamed to stay. Every head around the table turned toward the corner, toward the man in the janitor's uniform who was supposed to be invisible. Jack stepped forward, slow, measured. His boots thudded softly against the polished floor, each step louder than the chatter of stock forecasts or quarterly projections. His shoulders squared, not out of arrogance, but out of something deeper, a father's defiance. His eyes locked on Ronald, and in that moment the smirk slipped, if only slightly. Ronald had expected compliance, the kind of silence that keeps the hierarchy intact. What he got instead was a challenge from the last man in the building he thought capable of standing. "Relax, mop boy," Ronald said, his voice too thin, too casual to hide the falter beneath it. It was a joke. Jack's jaw tightened. He didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't lower his voice to soften the blow. "A joke, he said, calm and steady, "is what you tell to make people smile. That wasn't a joke, that was a weapon, and you aimed it at the only person in this world who gives my life meaning." The words didn't simply hang in the air, they split it. Every syllable cut through glass and marble, slicing clean through the illusion of untouchable power that filled this room every other night. Ronald's smirk froze, brittle as glass. A few executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly hyper-aware of how their laughter had sounded, how cruel it now echoed in their own ears. At the head of the table, Victoria Cross leaned back in her chair. Her usual armor, a smirk sharpened to a knife's edge, had slipped away. For the first time in years, this wasn't her room. It wasn't her empire. The air belonged to Jack. His presence, uninvited and unadorned, commanded it. Jack didn't move closer. He didn't raise his mop handle like a weapon. He didn't need to. The strength wasn't in his hands. It was in his stillness. He stared at Ronald, calm and unflinching, until the man's bravado cracked enough to expose the insecurity behind his tailored suit. The janitor's uniform, stained from years of night shifts, suddenly looked like something more, like armor forged in survival. The silence stretched. No one dared cough, shuffle papers, or even glance toward Victoria for permission to speak. Jack had stripped the room bare. He had reminded every person seated at that gleaming table that titles and paychecks meant nothing in the face of raw truth. Ronald opened his mouth, searching for something clever, something biting, but no words came. He had built his career on insults, sharpened them like blades, but this time he'd been cut by his own edge, and worse, he had been exposed as the weaker man. Jack finally let out a breath. Not a sigh, not defeat, just release. He didn't look at the others. He didn't care what they thought. His words hadn't been for them. They had been for Emma, for the little girl at home who trusted him to protect her when the world mocked what it didn't understand, for the child who drew castles out of crayons and believed her father built them. He took one step back, the moment still burning in the air. His hand brushed the folded paper in his pocket, and he felt steadier, stronger. He didn't need their approval, their applause, or even their silence. He had said what needed to be said. And in that single moment, Jack Carter, the janitor, the single dad, the invisible man, had turned a boardroom of billionaires into an audience that could not look away. For the first time in years, they weren't listening to numbers. They were listening to a man who refused to let his daughter's name be a punchline. And the room would never forget it. Victoria Cross was not a woman easily unsettled. For years she had sharpened herself against the world's most ruthless opponents, slicing through negotiations with senators, dismantling billionaires in private rooms, and disarming journalists who wielded microphones like loaded weapons. She had perfected the art of control, of never letting her breath hitch, never letting her tone waver, never letting anyone see where her armor ended and her skin began. But now, staring at the janitor standing in her boardroom, she felt something tighten in her chest that she couldn't quite name. Jack Carter hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't pleaded for sympathy. He hadn't even looked angry. What shook her was the opposite. The way he carried himself in absolute composure, as if rage had burned down to something sharper, steadier, and infinitely more dangerous. He didn't need theatrics. He didn't need noise. He stood in quiet defiance, and it was enough to change the air in the room. Around the table, her board shuffled awkwardly in their seats, glancing at their notes, pretending to read graphs they suddenly couldn't focus on. Ronald, ever the coward dressed in silk, muttered something about thin skin, but his voice was low, brittle. No one echoed his laughter this time. No one dared. Victoria's eyes, however, did not leave Jack. There was something about the way he had said it, my daughter. The word hadn't fallen from his lips as an excuse or a shield or a plea. It had rung through the room with reverence, not casual, not defensive, sacred. A declaration not just of who she was, but of who he was because of her. She leaned forward slowly, folding her hands on the polished table. For once, her tone softened, stripped of the bite she usually wore like perfume. "What's her name?" Jack blinked, caught off guard, his jaw still taut, but his voice steady. "Emma." Victoria nodded once, not absent-mindedly, but with precision, as though committing it to memory the way she would a key detail in a billion-dollar deal. Emma. The syllables landed with a weight she hadn't expected, as though the room had shifted around them. She didn't know why, but the name felt like a tether, grounding her in a way no quarterly report or investor call ever had. The meeting resumed after that, or at least it tried to. Numbers returned to the screens, voices returned to the air, but nothing felt the same. The graphs looked pale, the projections hollow. Ronald cleared his throat louder than necessary, trying to claw back attention, but the power he had once wielded with smug arrogance was gone, stripped bare by 5 words from a man no one in this room had ever considered worth hearing. Victoria kept her posture, kept her pen in hand, even nodded at the occasional figure presented on the screen. But beneath the performance, she was somewhere else entirely. Her thoughts circled back to Jack, to the rawness in his voice, to the way he had stood unflinching when faced with ridicule. He had no seat at this table, no title, no fortune. And yet his truth had carried more weight than all their carefully prepared reports. Why? Why did it feel heavier than her power? She had spent her life proving herself, building walls so high no one could see over them, and yet one man, with a mop in his hand and a daughter's name on his lips, had made her feel as though she had never really understood what it meant to protect something or someone. For the first time in years, Victoria Cross found herself distracted. Not by numbers, not by rivals, but by a man who was supposed to be invisible. And she couldn't shake the thought, perhaps she had spent so long learning how to command a room that she had forgotten what it meant to be moved by one. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles into the walls and lingers, even when the city outside thrummed with horns and sirens. Jack unlocked the door, stepping inside with the weight of the boardroom still clinging to his shoulders. His uniform smelled faintly of bleach, and his hands were raw from too many hours gripping a mop handle. But what struck him most when he walked in wasn't the exhaustion pressing down on his body. It was the stillness. Emma was curled up on the couch, legs tucked beneath her, sketchbook balanced on her lap. The lamp beside her threw a warm circle of light across the page, illuminating streaks of color, blues, yellows, deep red, her crayons working harder than her voice ever did. She didn't look up when he entered, but Jack had grown used to that. She had learned to retreat into her drawing since her mother died, retreating further each year until her silence became its own language. "Hey, kiddo," Jack said softly, lowering himself onto the edge of the couch. His voice was gentle, but it still felt too loud in the fragile air of the room. She shifted slightly, just enough to let him know she heard him. He tried again, quieter this time. "Did you draw today?" Emma nodded once. Her blonde hair slipped forward in a loose curtain as she tilted the sketchbook toward him. The paper showed 3 figures, 2 standing side by side, holding hands, and 1 standing apart, a little farther off, smaller, watching. Jack's chest tightened. He didn't need to ask who they were. He recognized the height of the taller figure, the broad shoulders sketched in uneven lines. That was him. The smaller figure beside him, with braids and sneakers Emma always included, was herself. And the third, standing apart, half faded into the corner of the page, was Rachel, her mother. Jack swallowed hard. The grief had dulled with time, but it was never gone. He felt it now like a bruise pressed too suddenly. He brushed a strand of hair back from Emma's face, his calloused fingers tender against her pale cheek. "You and me, kiddo," he whispered, forcing a smile through the ache. "Always." Her lips parted, and for the first time that day, he heard her voice. A single word, fragile but fierce in its hope. "Promise?" It was the only word she'd spoken all day, maybe all week. Jack's throat burned, but he leaned forward and kissed her forehead. "Promise." She looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing the strength of that word, before returning her gaze to the sketchbook. Jack stayed beside her, watching as she colored the space around the figures with swirls of blue. Silence filled the room again, but it wasn't the empty kind. It was their silence, shared, heavy with unspoken things. Jack leaned back into the couch, closing his eyes for just a moment. He thought of the boardroom, of Ronald's cruel words, of the way his daughter had been mocked without ever being present. The anger still smoldered in his chest, but here beside her he let it cool into something else. Resolve. Whatever the world thought of him, of her, didn't matter. What mattered was this couch, this light, this girl who trusted him to keep his word. Outside, the city pressed on, uncaring. Inside, Jack wrapped his arm gently around Emma, pulling her close. She rested her head against his chest, her sketchbook slipping slightly to the side, but she didn't let go of it. He breathed her in, the faint scent of crayons and childhood mixing with the bleach still clinging to his clothes. He had promised, and he meant it. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was how quickly that promise would be tested. Tomorrow would bring things he couldn't yet imagine, storms that would demand more from him than silence and strength. But for tonight, in that small apartment filled with the hum of a single lamp and the sound of crayons against paper, Jack Carter kept his daughter safe. And that was enough. The phone buzzed on the counter, its screen lighting up with an unfamiliar number. Jack glanced at it once and nearly let it ring itself into silence. Unknown numbers usually meant bills he couldn't pay, collections he couldn't reason with, or spam promising quick money he didn't want. But something in him, some quiet tug, made him reach for it anyway. "Mr. Carter?" The voice was clipped, precise, female. A voice used to commanding attention. Jack's chest tightened the moment he recognized it. Victoria Cross. He froze where he stood, staring at the sink full of breakfast dishes. A plate balanced precariously on top of the pile, yesterday's scrambled eggs still hardened at its edge. Across the room, Emma sat on the floor, her sketchbook open, humming softly to herself as she dragged a blue crayon in looping arcs. The normalcy of it, dishes, crayons, humming, clashed violently with the sharpness of that voice in his ear. "Yes?" he answered cautiously. "I want you to come to my office." "Today?" Jack frowned. His hand tightened around the phone. "If this is about last night—" "It's about Emma," she cut in. The name landed like a stone in his gut. His free hand braced against the counter. "What about my daughter?" There was a pause, a beat just long enough to make his pulse hammer harder. "I'll explain when you arrive." And then the line went dead. No goodbyes, no room for argument, just silence. Jack lowered the phone slowly, his knuckles still pale. Fear pressed against his ribs, but fury boiled beneath it. How did she know Emma's name? Why was she saying it like a card she could play? Like leverage. His instinct screamed to keep Emma far from that world, the world of polished boardrooms and people who laughed at things they didn't understand. But beneath the anger was something else. Curiosity he didn't want to admit. He stood there, torn between two instincts, the father who wanted to shield and the man who had stood tall last night, refusing to be invisible. "Daddy?" He turned. Emma was there, tugging gently at his sleeve. Her sketchbook was clutched against her chest, the page half hidden. She flipped it around shyly, revealing the drawing. A tall woman stood in the center, a crown perched unevenly on her head, lines of gold scribbled above her hair. Around her feet were shapes that looked like towers, maybe castles, maybe skyscrapers. Jack knelt beside her, his voice softer now. "Who's this?" Emma's eyes darted away, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Queen." The crayon crown glimmered faintly under the morning light. Something about the shape, the posture of the figure, made Jack think of Victoria Cross. That same unshakable poise, that same air of command. He looked down at his daughter's small hand smudged with color and felt the strange weight of inevitability settle over him. A queen had called, and somehow his little girl had already drawn her into their world. Jack sighed, his thumb brushing the edge of the page. He wanted to tell Emma not to worry, that queens belonged in stories, not in their lives. But deep down, he knew he couldn't refuse the summons. Victoria Cross had said Emma's name, and that meant the fortress of silence he'd built around them both was no longer enough. He pressed a kiss against the top of Emma's head, inhaling the scent of crayons and shampoo, and whispered, more to himself than to her, "Looks like we've got somewhere to be." Emma leaned against him without answering, her hum resuming quietly as she flipped to a new page. But her crown still shone in his mind long after he stood, pulling on his jacket and preparing for a meeting he already knew would change everything. Victoria's office was a world away from Jack's, where his home was cluttered with crayons, worn shoes by the door, and the constant hum of a fridge that never quite sealed right. Her space was built from glass and power. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched behind her like a stage backdrop, the skyline glittering in midday light. Steel accents caught the sun in sharp gleams, and every surface was immaculate, polished, cold. Not a photograph, not a family picture, not even a wilted plant to suggest someone lived here. It was less an office than a fortress, and sitting across from her desk felt like standing before a throne. Jack remained near the door, shifting uneasily, his mop bucket left in the hallway. His hands, rough and restless, stayed curled at his sides. He didn't belong here, and he knew it. He expected her to dismiss him, maybe warn him about speaking out of turn the night before, but instead, Victoria gestured toward the leather chair opposite her. "Sit." He didn't move. His voice came sharper than he meant it to, cutting through the sterile air. "What do you want with my daughter?" Most people, when confronted, recoiled, or bristled, or snapped back to reestablish dominance. Victoria Cross did none of these. She didn't even blink. Her expression stayed steady, her eyes sharp but unreadable. "I want to meet her." Jack frowned, caught off guard. He blinked as if making sure he'd heard right. "Why?" Victoria leaned back slowly in her chair, folding her arms across her chest. Her movements were measured, deliberate, like every gesture was a negotiation. "Because last night," she began, her voice lower now, "you made me realize something." Jack waited, silent, suspicious. She continued, her gaze fixed out the window for a brief moment before returning to him. "I've built empires. I've crushed rivals. I've signed contracts that rewrote entire industries. People look at me and see power. But when you spoke about Emma—" She paused, her jaw tightening, her eyes flickering with something unfamiliar. "I realized I don't know what it means to protect something I love." Jack's chest tightened. The words were strange coming from her. This woman who wielded control like a weapon. His instinct screamed to guard himself, to shield Emma from whatever this was. "She's not a case study," he said, voice firm, almost biting. "No," Victoria agreed quickly, almost too quickly. "She's a child who deserves to be seen. And I think—" Her arms loosened, her posture softening just slightly. "I think she could teach me something." The room felt heavier after her words, as if she'd confessed something larger than her pride wanted her to admit. Jack didn't answer right away. His eyes lingered on her, searching for the catch, the trap. He expected manipulation, another kind of weapon dressed as curiosity. But instead, all he saw was steel cracking, not crumbling, but bending just enough to reveal a sliver of humanity behind it. He exhaled slowly, the sound rough. "Emma isn't a lesson plan. She doesn't need to teach anyone anything." Victoria tilted her head. "Perhaps. But children teach us whether we ask them to or not." Jack's throat felt dry. He wanted to walk out, to shut the door on this impossible conversation. And yet, against every instinct, curiosity flickered inside him. Not trust, not yet. But something quieter, smaller. The faint, dangerous thought that maybe she wasn't here to take from them. Maybe she wanted to give something back. He shifted, still not sitting, still by the door, but his shoulders eased a fraction. Emma's drawing of the queen with the crooked crown flashed in his mind, unbidden. He didn't know why, but for the first time, the image didn't feel so far from reality. Victoria Cross had walked into countless rooms where the air shifted the moment she arrived. Boardrooms stiffened, journalists braced their pens, competitors sharpened their smiles. But as she stepped into Jack Carter's apartment, there was no shift at all, just the faint hum of a refrigerator, the smell of soap still clinging to the dishes drying in the rack, and a small girl at a kitchen table surrounded by a blizzard of crayon wrappers. The space was modest, almost bare, but it felt lived in, warm in a way her own penthouse never did. Emma sat with her head bent low, blonde strands falling forward as her hand moved in careful strokes across the page. Crayons rolled across the table like marbles, a few crushed beneath her elbow. She didn't look up when the door opened, didn't seem to notice the stranger standing there in a tailored coat, worth more than the rent Jack struggled to pay. Jack stayed close, arms crossed, shoulders tense. Every muscle in his body was a warning, ready to end this visit at the first hint of judgment, the first wrong word. His daughter had been a target once already, and he'd be damned if he let it happen in his own home. Victoria didn't bring her boardroom voice. She didn't let her usual command fill the room. Instead, she crouched slowly, lowering herself to Emma's level, her heels clicking once against the tile before she balanced on the balls of her feet. The floor was sticky in one corner, but she didn't care. She looked not at Jack, not at the space around them, but directly at the little girl whose silence seemed heavier than the apartment walls. "What are you drawing?" she asked, her voice soft, stripped of the edges she usually sharpened like knives. Emma's pencil paused for a fraction of a second. She didn't answer, but after a long moment she slid the paper forward. Victoria's gaze fell on the sketch, and for the first time in years, something in her throat tightened. The page showed 3 figures, drawn in uneven but certain strokes. They weren't far apart this time. They weren't fragmented or pushed to the corners. All 3 stood together hand in hand. Victoria blinked, her chest catching in a place she'd thought long closed. "Is this me?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper now. Emma's head lifted just enough for her eyes to meet Victoria's. She gave the smallest nod, barely there but undeniable. Jack's breath caught. His arms, still folded, dropped loosely at his sides. He hadn't seen Emma invite anyone into her drawing since Rachel died. Her pages had been full of empty spaces, of distant figures standing alone, of worlds where someone was always missing. But here, in shaky crayon lines, his daughter had given a stranger a place at her side. Victoria looked up at Jack, and he saw something he hadn't expected in her expression. It wasn't pride or power or calculation. It was humility, avaki. Vulnerability, even. For once, her presence didn't fill the room with pressure. Instead, it softened it. She didn't need control here. She didn't need a title or money to anchor her. Her power came from listening, from lowering herself, from letting a child draw her into a world where belonging was earned, not bought. The silence stretched, but it wasn't the suffocating kind Jack was used to. It was full, alive, trembling with something unspoken but undeniable. For the first time, Victoria Cross wasn't a queen behind a crown of glass towers. She was simply a woman being seen by a child. And for Jack, that was the most unexpected thing of all. The hallway smelled of lemon disinfectant and ambition. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the framed mission statements on the walls glanced like small mirrors at anyone passing. Jack pushed his mop bucket down the corridor with the practiced economy of someone who moves silently through other people's lives. He kept his head down most days, learned the art of being invisible, the survival skill of making himself as forgettable as a scuff mark on the floor. Today, though, the building felt different, tighter, like a fist curled around the city's throat. And he felt it in the way people glanced over their shoulders as if expecting a storm. Ronald Dempsey found storms delightful. He thrived on the currency of other people's discomfort, minting small cruelties into social capital. The man stood at the end of the corridor, a smirk set in a line of perfume and entitlement, circling a group of mid-level managers the way a hawk circles rabbits. His laugh floated out, ridiculous and sharp. "You know," he was saying, voice loud enough for the nearby offices to register, "we really should be thoughtful about these charity hires. They're great PR, but let's be honest. When it comes to metrics, the mop guy doesn't exactly move markets." A few nervous chuckles, the kind people offer to lubricate their fear. Jack's feet slowed. He didn't want attention. He never did. He kept moving, mopping the invisible seam along the baseboards, but then Ronald turned, aiming a barb with the precision of a practiced bully. "Maybe his kid doesn't talk because she knows her dad's just a janitor," Ronald sneered. And the corridor burst into that brittle laughter again, fast, sharp, a sound meant to pin someone down. The words hit like a cold hand on Jack's spine. Emma's face flickered in his mind, her small, secretive smiles, the way she pressed crayon lines into paper as if translating a private language. Something in him coiled. He felt the old reflex of silence, the one that had kept his rent paid and his head unbroken, rise up. He opened his mouth, closed it, chose to keep his shoulders steady. That's when the air in the corridor snapped. The joke was still hanging in the electric light when a sound cut through it, clear, controlled, and final. "Say that again?" Heads turned, conversations dying mid-breath. At the far end of the corridor, like a blade stepping out of a sheath, Victoria Cross stood, framed by glass and skyline. Her stilettos clicked with an almost surgical rhythm, heels striking tile like punctuation. She looked every inch the headline she'd become, polished, exacting, dangerous, but there was something else in her eyes now. A fire that didn't belong to corporate strategy. It belonged to someone who had been stung and decided to sting back with a different weapon. Ronald blinked, the practiced poise, flinching. "Victoria," he said, too smooth, too quick. "We were just—" She didn't let him finish. She walked toward them, each step shrinking his smirk. When she reached the cluster of suits, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "Mock the man if you want," she said. Words measured like legalese, but colder. "But mention his daughter again, and I will dismantle you so thoroughly you'll be Googling how to spell employment." It wasn't a threat that relied on bravado. It was the kind of sentence that landed because the woman saying it had the means to call every favor, leverage every ledger, and make a career evaporate. Silence followed her like a shadow. The chuckles evaporated, replaced by the rustle of cufflinks and the sound of someone swallowing pride. People looked between Ronald and Victoria as if watching a public execution and a rescue at once. Jack stood very still, mop handle in his hands like a staff. He met Victoria's eyes, and for a moment everything else blurred. The corridor, the fluorescent lights, the framed mission statements. He saw not the CEO, but the woman who had knelt in his apartment and asked his daughter what she was drawing, the woman who had listened. Ronald's color had fled from his face, his mouth open in a slow, petulant surprise, as if someone had removed his script mid-performance. He made a graceless attempt at a laugh that sounded like a cough. "We were joking." Victoria's voice was quiet, and that made it worse, the softest kind of fury. "This isn't a setting for private jokes about families," she said. "Keep your commentary to the numbers." The crowd dispersed like an embarrassed school, shoulders hunched, conversations rerouted, the swagger replaced by the careful, chastened gait of people who had been reminded they were mortal. Jack felt his heart thudding, a new unfamiliar steadiness under his ribs. He hadn't expected someone to stand beside him, not really, but there she was, a queen without a crown, and she'd chosen to defend what was, until this morning, just a crayon drawing tucked in his pocket. He realized then that being seen could be dangerous and kind in the same breath. He rolled his bucket away, the quiet squeak of its wheel sounding suddenly like a victory. Emma's name hung in the hallway like a shield, and for the first time in years, Jack Carter felt less like an invisible man and more like someone who belonged to something worth protecting. The apartment felt heavier than usual that night, though nothing had changed. Same flicker of the old lamp in the corner, same hum of the refrigerator, same pile of laundry waiting in a basket he kept promising himself he'd get to. But Jack lay awake on the couch, staring at the ceiling, unable to shut his mind off. He kept replaying the sound of Victoria's voice in the hallway, the way she had turned on Ronald, with a sharpness that silenced an entire floor. Not just sharp, it was furious. Not at him, not at his position, but on behalf of Emma. He turned the moment over and over like a stone in his hands, trying to understand its weight. Why had it mattered so much to her? Why had he mattered at all? Men like him weren't defended in glass towers. They were tolerated, ignored, dismissed. Yet when Emma's name had been spat into the air like a joke, Victoria had been the one to strike it down. Beside him, Emma stirred in her sleep. She had fallen asleep earlier, curled against his arm, sketchbook balanced on her knees until it slid to the floor. He picked it up now, brushing crumbs from the cover, and flipped it open carefully. The newest drawing was simpler than the others, just two figures side by side, and a third a little behind them, watching. He didn't have to wonder who she had meant. He'd seen that figure before, sketched faintly at the edges, but this time she wasn't as far away. Emma's voice broke the stillness, soft and small, drifting up from half-dreams. "She was loud," she whispered, eyes still closed. Jack turned, brushing hair gently from her forehead. "Who was?" Her lips curved faintly. "The Queen." But safe loud. Jack felt his chest tighten, safe loud. He repeated the words under his breath, letting the weight of them sink in. Emma, who hated noise, who flinched at laughter meant to hurt, had found comfort in the sharpest voice in the building. He smiled softly, stroking her hair. "Safe loud," he echoed. But when her breathing deepened again and the rhythm of sleep reclaimed her, Jack's own thoughts refused to settle. He stared at the ceiling once more, his mind looping back to Victoria's eyes. Not the fire when she had threatened Ronald, but the moment after, when she looked at him, steady, unflinching, as though he wasn't the man with a mop bucket in the corner, but someone she actually respected. It rattled him more than Ronald's words ever could. He wasn't sure if it was trust. He wasn't sure if he was even allowed to name it that. Trust was a language he hadn't spoken in years, not since Rachel died, and the world demanded he become everything at once: mother, father, protector, provider. Every promise he made was carved out of exhaustion, every smile for Emma stretched across grief that never fully healed. Trust was too expensive a word for someone like him, and yet something in the way Victoria had said Emma's name, the way she had stepped forward without hesitation, had cracked a door he thought he'd bolted shut. He felt a flicker, small and reluctant, in the space between anger and exhaustion, something that looked almost like hope. Jack turned on his side, listening to Emma's soft breathing. He reached out and rested his hand lightly on her sketchbook, grounding himself in the pages filled with her colors, her worlds, her quiet. "Safe loud," he whispered again, a half-smile tugging at his mouth. Maybe it wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something, a seed planted in the most unlikely soil, his silence, her fire. And in a world where he had long since stopped expecting anything to grow, the thought of it unsettled him enough to keep him awake until the first gray edge of morning brushed against the blinds. Jack almost said no. Every reason lined up neatly in his mind: the rent due in 2 weeks, the fraying collar of his one decent shirt, the way a ballroom full of silk gowns and diamond cufflinks had nothing to do with him. But Emma had looked up at him with wide, pleading eyes and whispered a single word she almost never used: "Please." Her voice, fragile and certain, was enough to cut through his hesitation. He couldn't say no, not to that. The night of the gala arrived wrapped in glitter. Chandeliers blazed like constellations trapped in crystal, their reflections scattering across walls of polished gold and glass. Music swelled from a string quartet in the corner, smooth and practiced, blending with the clink of champagne flutes and the polished laughter of people who measured themselves by the weight of their wallets. Jack stood at the edge of it all, his arms stiff as Emma clung tightly to him, her small hand gripping his sleeve like a lifeline. Tucked under her other arm was her sketchbook, pressed to her chest like a shield. He kept to the margins, steering them around the whirl of sequins and chatter, feeling the gaze of strangers slide over him and just as quickly dismiss him. His clothes, neat but ordinary, stood out against the sea of tailored elegance. He reminded himself it didn't matter. Emma wanted to be here. That was enough. And then, like a shadow moving in too close, Ronald appeared. His suit was cut sharp, his tie glimmering faintly, his smirk the same one Jack had seen too many times before. Ronald's voice, low enough to carry but loud enough to sting, dripped with mockery. Bringing the help to mingle with the highborn? How quaint. The words struck like a slap. Jack's jaw tightened, his hand twitching toward his daughter's shoulder protectively. He opened his mouth, ready to deliver the sharp retort building in his chest, when Emma surprised him. She stepped forward, small and certain, her sketchbook clutched in both hands. Without a word, she flipped to a page and held it up to Ronald. The drawing was unmistakable. Ronald, sketched in crayon, standing small and insignificant in the corner of a room. Around him towered others, faceless, larger, stronger. His figure was dwarfed, reduced to nothing more than a minor smudge in the margins of the page. For a moment Ronald didn't move. He stared at the paper, the mocking lines of childish truth, and his smirk faltered. Around them, laughter stilled, conversations thinned, heads turned, the current of the gala shifting toward the quiet drama at the edge of the room. Jack's breath caught in his throat. His daughter, who barely spoke, who let crayons and silence be her language, had just struck harder than he ever could with words. His hand hovered near her shoulder, not to pull her back this time, but in awe. Across the ballroom, Victoria Cross watched from her vantage point near the stage. Her gaze lingered on the girl, on the drawing, on the way Ronald's swagger had collapsed under the weight of silence. And then, slowly, she smiled. Not her boardroom smile, not the one designed to unsettle rivals, but something faint, quiet, almost reverent. Emma lowered the sketchbook, her face unreadable, and stepped back to Jack's side. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The room had already heard her loud and clear. Jack bent toward her, whispering so only she could hear. "You didn't say anything," he murmured. "But you said everything." She looked up at him with the barest flicker of a smile, and in that glittering hall full of noise and power, it was the quietest person in the room who left the deepest mark. The night air outside the ballroom was cooler than expected, a soft breeze carrying the faint scent of city rain that had passed earlier. The hum of engines in the distance and the occasional car door slamming echoed through the nearly empty parking lot. Victoria's heels clicked against the pavement, but the rhythm was different now, slower, less like a drumbeat of command and more like a woman unhurried, reluctant to end the night. Jack walked beside her, his jacket folded over one arm, Emma clutching his hand on the other side. The child leaned her head against his arm, her sketchbook tucked beneath her elbow as if it were something sacred. Jack noticed the way Victoria's shoulders sat lower than usual, her spine less rigid, her voice, when it finally came, softer. "I hate those galas," she confessed suddenly, her tone carrying no edge, no strategy. Jack turned his head, surprised by the honesty. "You looked like you owned the room." A quiet laugh slipped from her, low and almost bitter. "That's the trick. You wear the crown long enough, people stop asking if it hurts. They paused beneath a lamppost, its glow painting their faces in warm amber. Jack studied her. The diamond-hard CEO who had silenced Ronald, who held entire companies in the palm of her hand, suddenly looked human. There were cracks in her armor tonight, hairline fractures he hadn't seen before, and through them something softer flickered. "So why do it?" he asked. The question came without judgment, just curiosity. Victoria's gaze dropped to the pavement. She hesitated, the silence stretching between them until Jack thought she might retreat behind her mask again. But then her voice broke through, quiet, trembling at the edges. "Because I thought if I controlled everything, maybe no one would notice I didn't know how to love anything right." The admission hit him harder than he expected. There it was, the truth beneath the empire, the ache beneath the crown. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, a tug at his sleeve drew his attention. Emma stood between them, her eyes bright in the lamplight, holding out a page from her sketchbook. Victoria blinked as Emma pressed the drawing into her hands. A queen stood at the center, her crown tilted slightly, not perfect, but her mouth curved into a smile. Around her, two figures stood close, one tall, one small, hands reaching not for the crown, but for her. Victoria froze, staring at the page as if it were a mirror she had never dared look into. Her eyes shimmered, the control she held so tightly over herself slipping. Her lips parted, but no words came. Jack glanced at the drawing, then back at Victoria. His voice was gentle, low enough to almost blend with the hum of the city around them. "She sees more than most." Victoria swallowed, her throat working as she fought to steady herself. Finally she nodded, her voice a whisper threaded with something rare, vulnerability. "So does her father." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of the honesty she'd allowed, of the gift Emma had given, of the fragile bridge being built in the cool night air. For the first time, Victoria Cross wasn't a CEO, wasn't the untouchable woman in the glass tower. She was simply a woman without a mask, standing in a parking lot with a janitor and his daughter, clutching a drawing that dared to see her as more than the crown she wore. And Jack, for the first time in years, felt the stirrings of something he thought he'd buried long ago: trust. The whispers came first, snaking through polished hallways and echoing across late-night phone calls between directors who never missed a chance to measure weakness. A CEO seen too often with a janitor. A child's name murmured in circles that thrived on speculation. Unprofessional, they muttered. Dangerous optics. A liability to shareholders. To men and women who traded in perception as much as profit, the story wasn't just gossip, it was threat. Greg Halverson delivered the message plainly. He always did. Head of PR for 12 years, Greg was a man with perfect ties and an even more perfect sense for blood in the water. He stood in Victoria's office that afternoon, posture stiff, voice clipped. The glass walls around them reflected the skyline, the city stretching endlessly in neat grids, but his eyes were pinned only on her. "You've built this empire on precision," he said coldly. "Every line of your life measured, calculated. Now you're risking it for a janitor's kid?" Victoria sat behind her desk, the leather of her chair creaking as she leaned back. Her jaw tightened, but her voice was calm. "Her name is Emma." Greg scoffed, lips curling. "And Emma doesn't belong in our headlines. You know how this works. Stories like that grow teeth. Pull back before this explodes." The office was silent for a long beat, the kind of silence that usually gave Victoria power, the weight of her decisions pressing down on whoever sat across from her. But today it pressed on her. She turned her chair toward the vast windows, staring out at the glass towers piercing the afternoon sky. She had bowed to this view for years, let money and image tell her who she was supposed to be. She had built herself into a fortress no one could breach. But as Greg's words settled in the air for the first time, she asked herself a question she had never allowed. What do I actually care about? Greg's footsteps faded eventually, his warnings left behind like smoke. But the words clung, and by evening they drove her somewhere she hadn't planned on going. Jack's apartment was nothing like her office. The hallway smelled faintly of old carpet cleaner, and the door's paint was chipped near the handle. She hesitated before knocking, almost turning back, but something heavier than pride anchored her there. When the door opened, Jack looked at her with quiet surprise. He didn't ask why she was standing on his threshold, heels clicking against the scuffed floor. He simply waited. "They want me to walk away," she admitted, her voice low, stripped of its usual steel. Jack studied her, his expression unreadable, but his silence wasn't cold. It was patient, steady. Finally he asked, "And what do you want?" The question landed harder than Greg's threats, harder than any headline she could imagine. What did she want? For years the answer had been easy. Power, control, victory. But standing there, the faint hum of his apartment behind him, the sketchbook lying on the table just inside, she felt her throat tighten. "I think—" She swallowed hard, her gaze dropping for the first time in years. "I think I want to stay." Jack's eyes softened just slightly, the weight of her words sinking between them. For once, she wasn't the CEO who had commanded entire industries. She wasn't the queen who wore the crown until her scalp bled. She was just a woman, standing outside a janitor's apartment, admitting she wanted something real, and in the quiet that followed, she realized how much it terrified her, and how much it mattered. The hum of the refrigerator filled the small kitchen, a steady backdrop to the late hour. The overhead light was dim, flickering slightly, as if it, too, carried the exhaustion of the day. Jack sat at the scarred wooden table, a chipped mug of coffee cooling between his hands. Across from him, Victoria sat straighter than the chair deserved, her blouse still perfect despite the long evening. But something in her posture had softened. For once, she wasn't in her glass tower. She was here, in his narrow kitchen, waiting. Jack's hands flexed around the mug, his jaw working as if he were wrestling words too heavy to lift. For years he had buried them under routine, mopping floors, making dinners, folding Emma's clothes, patching together the edges of their life. But now, with Victoria's steady gaze anchored on him, the words came. "Her name was Rachel," he began quietly. The syllables trembled as though saying her name out loud was a door he hadn't dared open in years. Emma's mom. Victoria didn't interrupt. She simply nodded once, her eyes steady, inviting him to go on. "She loved music," he said, "not just listening, living in it. She used to tease me that I played piano like the keys owed me an apology. He smiled faintly, then it broke. She laughed at everything, even when we had nothing, especially then. His voice caught, and he let out a breath that sounded more like a confession. The night Emma was born, something went wrong. Rachel. His throat closed, and he pressed a hand against his mouth, steadying himself. She didn't make it through. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was reverent. Victoria's eyes softened, but she didn't try to fill the space with words. Jack continued, his voice raw. I sat beside her hospital bed, holding Emma in my arms, and I promised Rachel I'd raise her with music and gentleness, that I'd never let the world make her feel small. But the truth is, his shoulders shook once. I came so close to breaking. I thought she deserved better than a father who cleans floors for a living. I thought maybe she'd look at me one day and see nothing but failure. He dropped his gaze to the table, shame pressing his shoulders down. Victoria leaned forward, her voice firm, unwavering. She doesn't need a CEO, Jack. She doesn't need perfect. She needs you. The words landed with the weight of truth, and something inside Jack cracked. His eyes burned, not with anger, but with release. From the living room, Emma stirred on the couch. She rolled over in her sleep, her small voice drifting into the kitchen like a benediction. Safe, she whispered, before sinking back into dreams. Jack closed his eyes, his chest aching. He hadn't realized how badly he needed to hear that word from her. Victoria reached across the table then, her hand brushing against his. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't forceful. It was simple, human. Her touch was warm, steady, and for the first time since Rachel's death, Jack didn't pull away. He let someone else share the weight he had carried alone for too long. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't the silence of grief or loneliness. It was a silence filled with breath, with presence, with healing. Jack sat back, his hand still resting against hers, and let himself believe, just for a moment, that maybe promises made in hospital rooms could still be kept, and maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to keep them alone. The photograph spread faster than wildfire, faster than rumor, faster than truth could ever catch up. A grainy image of Victoria Cross standing outside the gala, her head tilted back in laughter, Jack beside her with his jacket folded over his arm. It wasn't intimate, not really. But the timing, the angle, the smile, those were enough to ignite tabloids hungry for scandal. By morning, headlines screamed across glossy covers and glowing phone screens. CEO? Falls for custodian? Within hours, the fallout began. Investors called emergency meetings, their polished voices taut with fury. Unacceptable optics, they snapped. Reckless. Journalists camped outside the building with long lenses and impatient microphones. Every entrance was crowded with shouted questions. Meanwhile, Ronald, always eager to pour gasoline on embers, slipped private memos to the press. Lines about unprofessional fraternization and potential liabilities suddenly painted Jack as a distraction, a threat to the empire Victoria had built, brick by ruthless brick. Jack felt the ground tilt beneath him. The quiet fortress he'd tried to build around Emma's life suddenly seemed paper-thin, shredded by cameras and whispers. He didn't care about his name in a headline, but Emma, his daughter who lived in drawings and silence, wasn't built for this kind of glare. He paced their small apartment, his hands trembling as he looked at Victoria across the worn table. "You don't have to protect us," he said finally, his voice breaking with the weight of it. "We'll disappear. It's what we do best. I can take her somewhere else, somewhere no one will ever know our names. You don't need to risk everything for us." Victoria's eyes burned with something fierce, unshakable. She shook her head slowly, deliberately. "I'm done disappearing." The words stunned him into silence. For years, Jack had watched her in headlines, in boardrooms, always poised, always calculating. But in that moment, she was stripped of every layer of performance. She wasn't the queen in the crown, She wasn't the CEO with skyscrapers under her command. She was simply a woman choosing not to hide anymore. The next morning, the press conference drew the largest crowd the building had ever seen. Cameras lined the rows like an army, lenses polished and merciless. Microphones leaned forward like hungry mouths waiting to devour her words. Staff whispered nervously in the wings, wondering if their leader had finally cracked. Jack stood near the edge of the room, Emma's hand in his heart pounding so loudly he was certain it could be heard. He expected Victoria to step out in her armor, flawless makeup, a suit so sharp it could slice through criticism, but when she emerged, the room gasped. She wore no makeup, no carefully orchestrated mask. Her dark hair was pinned simply at the back of her neck, her suit plain, her face bare. She walked to the podium and placed her hands flat on its surface. Flashbulbs exploded, the light harsh and unrelenting. She didn't flinch. "Yes," she began, her voice clear, cutting through the chaos. "I spend time with Jack Carter." The words hit like a stone, dropped into a silent lake. Cameras clicked frantically. "Yes, I care about his daughter." Her eyes swept over the crowd, steady, unashamed. "And if that makes me less of a CEO to you, then maybe you've forgotten what leadership actually means." The room broke into a stunned hush, reporters scrambling to record every word. Some gasped, some whispered furiously, but no one dared interrupt. Jack watched from the sidelines, Emma's small fingers tightening around his hand. He felt his chest ache as though someone had carved space in it he hadn't known was closed. Victoria had just risked her empire for them, for Emma, for him. In that blinding storm of cameras and questions, Jack Carter realized he was no longer invisible. And Victoria Cross, for the first time, seemed more powerful than she ever had in her crown of glass, because now she stood without it. The storm after the press conference didn't pass. It swelled. Stocks took a dive so sharp, headlines printed it in red. Editorials sliced Victoria open with smug precision, calling her reckless, irresponsible, unstable. Protesters clustered outside the glass tower with signs that read, "Protect shareholders, not janitors." Jack did his best to keep Emma away from the noise, to shield her from a world that suddenly felt sharper, louder, more dangerous. But the truth was already circling them like wolves, waiting for a crack. The shareholder meeting was supposed to be Victoria's redemption, a stage where she could claw back control with numbers and authority. The room was packed, every leather chair occupied, cameras broadcasting live, investors leaning forward with sharpened smiles. Victoria stood at the front, her hands steady on the podium, though her eyes betrayed the sleepless nights behind them. She defended her choices with poise, her voice unwavering, but the undercurrent of mockery buzzed low. Whispered chuckles, smirks exchanged between men in tailored suits who believed money made them untouchable. Jack sat in the back row, Emma curled beside him, her sketchbook balanced on her knees. He had told her they would just sit quietly, that she didn't need to do anything, just be there. She hadn't spoken a word since the morning, her silence as deep and private as always, but her hand never left her crayons. And then it happened. Another laugh, louder this time, cut through the room as Victoria paused mid-sentence. It was cruel, calculated, meant to remind everyone that her words didn't matter, that her reputation was bleeding out in front of them. Jack felt his fists clench, his chest burning with helpless fury. Before he could stand, before he could do anything, Emma moved. She stood up. The small scrape of her chair legs was swallowed by the noise, but when her voice came, thin and shaking, it carried with a clarity no microphone could manufacture. "Stop laughing at my dad." The room froze. Every head turned. The silence was so sudden, it rang. Emma's voice was soft, but it didn't falter. Her hands clutched her sketchbook against her chest, the cover bent from use. Slowly she lifted it high, flipping to a page already waiting. On it, 3 figures drawn in bold strokes of crayon, one tall with broad shoulders, one crowned with a crooked gold triangle, and one small with a braid and sneakers. They weren't apart. They weren't broken. They stood hand in hand. "We're family," she said. Her words trembled, her lip quivered, but she pushed them out into the stillness, each syllable breaking like dawn over the room. "We're family." For a child who had built her life in silence, who had learned to hide her voice in drawings and whispers, the moment was seismic. The cameras, hungry for scandal, swung toward her, zooming in on the small girl with the trembling chin and the courage of a giant. Reporters went quiet. Investors blinked, their smirks collapsing under the weight of her truth. Jack's chest ached so fiercely he thought he might break open. Pride, raw and unstoppable, spilled through him until his eyes burned. He rose slowly, one hand resting on Emma's shoulder, steadying her but not pulling her back. This wasn't his fight to shield her from, this was hers, and she was standing taller than he ever had. At the podium, Victoria's composure shattered in the most human way. Her eyes filled with tears she didn't bother to hide. She pressed her hand to her chest, looking at Emma as though she were seeing the embodiment of everything she had been trying to defend, everything she couldn't quite put into words. The world had wanted a scandal, a headline, a downfall. But what they got was a child's voice, fragile yet unbroken, rewriting the narrative with crayons and courage. And in that instant the empire shifted, not through power or profit, but through the undeniable truth of a little girl who refused to let laughter define her father. The days after Emma's voice broke across television screens felt different. Something subtle had shifted in the current of public opinion, like the wind had turned without warning. Where once the headlines had been cruel, mocking, now they carried a strange reverence. Parents wrote letters, stacks of them, describing how their own children had been silenced, how Emma reminded them of what bravery looked like in its smallest form. Teachers sent notes saying Jack's dignity gave them hope for the quiet kids in their classrooms, the ones who drew worlds on paper instead of speaking them aloud. Ordinary people, people with no stocks, no power, no seats at the table, began to care. And that caring, once unleashed, was harder to contain than any scandal. Even shareholders, who had first spat fire and threats, began to reconsider. They saw the numbers dip but stabilize. They saw the press not just chasing scandal anymore, but humanizing a story that had once been easy to ridicule. The tide was turning, and Ronald and Greg, who had stoked the flames with whispers and memos, felt the ground under them begin to shift. They scrambled, spinning narratives, feeding the press lines about a company losing its edge, about spectacle overtaking strategy. But the world wasn't listening to them anymore. The reckoning came in the boardroom. The glass walls reflected a city restless with noise, but inside, the silence was taut as a wire. Jack wasn't in the room. This was Victoria's battle. But his shadow lingered, and Emma's voice still haunted every corner of the building. The directors sat stiffly, folders stacked in front of them, their eyes sharp but wary. Greg broke first. He leaned forward, his suit too perfect, his sneer too rehearsed. "You've turned us into a circus," he spat. "All this talk about janitors and children while our competitors tighten their grip. You've abandoned precision for sentiment." His words dripped with disdain, but beneath it was fear, the kind of fear that comes when power slips through grasping fingers. Victoria didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She leaned forward, her elbows resting on the table, her voice slicing through the room cold and sharp. "No," she said, each syllable deliberate. "I've turned this company into something human." A ripple moved through the board, uneasy, uncertain. Greg laughed once, brittle. "Humanity doesn't pay dividends." Victoria's gaze locked on him, steel beneath the surface of her calm. "If humanity is bad for business," she said, her tone low and lethal, "then you can take my title. Strip the crown from my head if it makes you feel taller, but you will never take my name." The words landed like a hammer against glass. Silence followed, not the polite kind that waits for someone to finish, but the heavy kind that signals something has just shifted irreversibly. For the first time in years, the board didn't laugh. They didn't threaten. They folded. Their power wilted in the face of a woman who no longer needed their approval to stand tall. Greg's jaw clenched, his smirk gone. Within a week, his resignation hit the wires, disguised in press language about new opportunities. Ronald disappeared even faster, his smugness vanishing into obscurity, his voice finally silenced by his own irrelevance. And Victoria Cross, once mocked for risking her empire on a janitor and his daughter, emerged stronger, not as the CEO chained to numbers on a ledger, not as the queen in a crown too heavy to wear, but as a leader anchored in truth. The woman who had once believed control was the only way to survive had chosen something braver. She had chosen to be seen, and the world, against every expectation, had chosen to see her back. Months had passed, but the change was unmistakable. The skyscraper that once loomed like a fortress of glass and steel now held a heart, beating on one of its forgotten floors. Where there had been dust and storage rooms, Victoria had carved out something alive. The floor had been stripped, painted, rebuilt into a space that breathed warmth instead of intimidation. Walls were covered in murals, canvases stacked in corners, instruments leaned against chairs as if waiting to be played. And above the door, in bold letters, the name Emma's Room welcomed anyone who walked inside. The space became a haven. Children from neighborhoods that rarely brushed shoulders with skyscrapers poured in, their laughter bouncing off walls that had once echoed only with corporate footsteps. They painted stars in wild colors, played tentative notes on out-of-tune violins, and discovered corners where silence didn't mean loneliness, but rest. Some came shyly, hiding behind parents or older siblings. Others rushed in like they'd been waiting their whole lives. All of them belonged. Jack found his rhythm there, too. In the afternoons, he sat at the piano, teaching small hands to find middle C, to press gently, to listen to the way sound carried. He taught not like a man following a lesson plan, but like a father who had learned the language of patience. The music wasn't flawless, but it was real. Hesitant notes stitched together into something hopeful. Emma blossomed in the space. Her sketchbook grew heavier with each passing day, filled not just with solitary figures, but with groups, communities, circles of hands holding hands. She drew on walls now, too, her crayons traded for paintbrushes. Murals stretched across the space, exploding with blues, reds, yellows. Colors she once avoided now flowing freely, spilling joy into every corner. Her silence softened. She spoke in shy fragments, in whispers that turned to laughter when she was surrounded by children who didn't need her to be anyone but herself. And Victoria, stripped of her skyscraper crown, became something else entirely. She would walk in after meetings, heels dangling from her fingers, hair tumbling loose around her shoulders. She'd drop onto the floor, cross-legged among the kids, a coloring book open in front of her. She didn't give orders there. She didn't negotiate. She simply belonged, her laughter softer, her voice less guarded. Sometimes she sat quietly, her eyes lingering on the murals Emma painted, as though searching for herself in every brushstroke. One evening, as the city outside pulsed with its usual restless energy, the three of them stayed late. The lights of the skyline glittered through the windows, casting the room in a gentle glow. Emma had been working quietly in the corner, crayons and markers scattered like a halo around her. She walked over, her steps deliberate, and held out a page. Jack took it carefully, his calloused fingers brushing the edges. The drawing was familiar. 3 figures, just as she had drawn so many times before. But this one was different. They weren't standing in empty space. They were surrounded by swirls of color, reds, blues, yellows blending into one another, not separate, but whole. And at the bottom, written in shaky, uneven handwriting, was one word: home. Jack's throat tightened. He swallowed hard, his chest full in a way that hurt and healed all at once. He looked at Emma, then at Victoria, who was already gazing at the page with shimmering eyes. Slowly, without speaking, Victoria reached across the table and touched Jack's hand. Her fingers lingered, steady, grounding. In that moment, the noise of the city fell away. Jack felt the weight of survival he had carried for years ease from his shoulders. He wasn't just a father clawing through each day anymore. He was a man living fully, deeply, beside a daughter who had found her voice and a woman who had learned how to take off her crown. The janitor, the CEO, and the little girl who drew hope had found what they had each been chasing in their own way. Not victory, not wealth, not control. Family. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. What part of Jack, Emma, and Victoria's journey spoke to you most? And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because more stories of hope, courage, and second chances are on the way. Until next time, stay kind, stay brave, and never stop believing in the power of family.